The old Highway 99, adjacent to Seattle's SeaTac Airport. 30 years ago, a notorious spot.
This area, back in the early 80s, was had a very transient population. There could rent rooms for an hour or two.
Faye Brooks, then a detective assigned to sex crime cases, was regularly called to the street known simply as the Strip.
There were a lot of young women who were working the streets.
All the girls were young, and you know, some of them had troubled past, but all of them are somebody's daughter and somebody's sister.
A lot of the young girls had grown up in abusive homes, and that was why they were running away. And I could relate to that. I'm a survivor of child sex abuse, and you know, there but for the grace of God were I, and so I could certainly empathize with them, and I also wanted to help them.
One such woman was Marcia Chapman, a street worker who claimed to have been raped.
And the apartment building where she lived was right here.
Marcia was a beautiful, statuesque black woman. She was 31. She had 3 children. She couldn't support them on the job she could get, and she was working as a prostitute.
She was living in an apartment that was sparsely furnished, so I think she was like down on her luck. She seemed to have a kind heart and was a nice person. But, you know, under the circumstances, she did what she had to do to make ends meet.
Marcia's alleged rape was typical of the hazards working girls on the Strip faced. At the time, best-selling crime writer Ann Rule lived just blocks from the area.
I would sometimes stop and warn them and say, do you know what I do for a living? I write about murder. And you don't have a chance out here. How do you know who you're getting in with? And usually they would just shrug and walk away.
In 1982, the dangers of working the Strip would be brought home by a discovery in the nearby Green River.
There was a man on the water in a boat, and he saw underneath the water what he thought was a mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a human being, and there were 2 of them there. Well, one of the victims in the water, her hand was just waving with the current of the water. And it was like, here I am, please help me. But of course it was too late.
As police investigated the crime scene, they made another grim find.
Processing the scene where the victim in the water was where we found the 3rd victim on the banks.
They were all within a few feet of each other, and so clearly, you know, the same killer had put all 3 of the bodies there.
All 3 women had been picked up from around the Strip by what the FBI dubbed an organized serial killer.
The organized offender was more planned, more premeditated, was able to conceptualize crimes and carry them out very efficiently, namely because of the fact that they had very little feeling for another human being. They looked at a victim as an object for their excitement. Basically, you're talking about a sexual psychopath.
The victims were 16-year-old Opal Mills, 17-year-old Cynthia Jean Hines, and 31.
When I found out that it was Marcia, I was I don't think I had any words that I could say. It was like, oh my God, somebody killed her. It was really sad.
We did not know this was only the beginning of a reign of terror, and we wouldn't know who was doing this for a very long time.
On Seattle's Strip, the Green River Killer had found a rich hunting ground. That would enable him to amass a body count any serial killer in American history. By autumn of 1980, on the 15th of September 1982, 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan vanishes.
Bridget was the much-loved daughter of a Catholic family in Bellevue, a very rich suburb of Seattle. She skipped school a lot. She joined up with a boyfriend named Ray, and they were living in a cheap motel on Highway 99. She left. I think she was still possibly turning a few tricks, and she didn't come back. Her family was so upset because she was
murder that investigators could conclusively tie him to.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 5?
Guilty.
When he confessed, and when I sat and listened to him say guilty.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Marcia Chapman?
Guilty.
After every one of the names that they had said,
For the death of Mary B. Meehan?
Guilty.
I just sat there and cried, and that's when
Based
it
upon my observations,
finally sunk in that this is real. He did it. There's someone else inside of him when he went through the door and left to go to work. He wasn't the man that I knew.
count 19 for the death of Linda Rule?
Guilty.
I would think back and think about all those years that I was with him. Were they real? Or was he just using me?
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 48?
Guilty.
I lived with him all those years. He could have killed me. He could have killed my daughters. He could have killed my grandbabies.
So what made the monster? Was it his unusual upbringing? Or was Gary Ridgway born to kill?
I still don't believe that any child is born to kill, but I think some children have a predisposition to violence. If the child grows up in a safe place for them, where they feel loved, where they attach, we're never going to know that that predisposition for violence is there. But if that child is born into a home
one of my ominous signs. She was somewhat seductive and so on. These sorts of unhealthy relationships with the maternal figure.
People that I've encountered that have been prosecuted for murder, I think that their circumstances have driven them to do what they have done in the majority of cases that I have handled. Ridgway. I truly believed that he was born that way, hardwired that way.
Nature piece. I think at some point it's a decision. And I think we all have some propensities for violence, but you can decide, you can control it. And he decided how he wanted to control it.
19 years after Marcia Chapman's body was discovered beneath the surface of the Green River, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to serve 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
In the end, Marcia got her justice because it was DNA found on her that they could match with Gary Ridgway. And Marcia got her day.
That was a good day. It was a good day.
Before Ridgway was led away, Judge Richard Jones instructed him to face the victims' families.
There's a tremendous amount of emotion that these family members wanted to pour out for Gary Ridgway to hear.
I can only hope someone gets the opportunity to choke you unconscious so you can live through the horror that you put our daughters, our sisters, our mothers through.
The pain would not go away, but it brought them closure.
The one thing that I want you, Gary Ridgway, to know I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
I think for all of us, as we brought the families up and introduced them, it was really emotional.
I recall Linda Rule's father.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them.
Was very sympathetic, very compassionate individual.
What God says to do, and that's to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
On one hand, I'm sitting next to a person who's done the most inhumane things to other human beings, and then 15 feet away is a person doing the most humane and merciful thing.
I wanted him to look out, see the pain, see the anger, and see all the agony that he'd caused in his lifetime. I wanted him to take that visual image with him back to prison. So for the balance of his life, that would be the last public image that he had.
You took from me my firstborn child. May her soul and the soul of the other 47 victims rest in peace.
"5'4", Donald Pee Wee Gaskins would earn himself the title, the meanest man in America.
If you had a business dispute, you'd sue him. Pee Wee'd kill him.
A serial killer who, if he's to be believed, was responsible for over 100 cruel and sickening murders.
Right over here is where he drowned Doreen, and then he hit the baby in the back of the head and hatchet after he had raped her. The total amount is 105 people.
A man who wouldn't stop killing, even on death row.
Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hello everyone, As always, just like it says in the intro, I am Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery, and I am so glad that you're joining me here today. Last week we dipped our toes in the lighter side of true crime, relatively speaking, with the story of the Barefoot Bandit. Today we're headed back to the dark, ugly alleys of human nature to meet another serial killer, another American monster, Michael John Bray, the serial rapist and murderer who would become famous, infamous, notorious as Cowboy Mike. So if you're ready for another bumpy ride through terrible things that have been but should never be, then please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murdery's American Monster, Cowboy Mike, starts now. Just over 2 decades ago, in the summer of 2001, a predator walked among the unsuspecting residents of Western Washington. He moved quietly, slipping through towns and hamlets and leaving devastation in his wake. This man, this American monster, was Michael John Bray, better known as Cowboy Mike. He was a serial killer and serial rapist who left behind him a tragic trail of violence, terror, and shattered lives. And the authorities might never have caught him if it weren't for the courage of a single woman who provided a tip that ultimately led to whatever it is we think your typical killer looks like. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with a rugged cowboy charm that allowed him to slip easily into the nightlife of Washington's small towns. Wearing his signature jean jacket and cowboy hat, he could blend in with the regulars at local watering holes like Bailey's Lounge in Olympia, the Red Barn in Grand Mound, and the Roadside Inn Tavern in Glenoma. But behind that disarming exterior was a man with dark and hideous intentions. Lori Jones was one of the first to fall into Bray's deadly web that summer. She'd gone to Bailey's Lounge in Olympia for what should have been a normal Saturday night out. Lori had been stood up by an online date, and maybe she just needed to forget about it for a while, to lose herself in the music and the comfort of strangers. But that night, she met Cowboy Mike. The two danced together, drank whiskey, and seemed to hit it off. To the barman and the other patrons, they might have looked just like another couple enjoying a night out. But for Lori, the night would end in tragedy. Lori's daughter Elise had been away on a fishing trip that weekend. When she returned home, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The apartment was eerily quiet, and her mother was nowhere to be found. In a state of growing panic, Elisa approached the building manager and asked him to help her unlock the door. When they opened it, the sight that greeted them was beyond anything Elisa could have imagined. Lori's naked body lay hidden beneath the bed. Her life snuffed out in a moment of unforgivable violence. It was a brutal and calculated murder, and by the time her body was discovered, Michael John Bray was long gone. The police were called and the investigation began. Lori's apartment became a crime scene, and detectives combed through every inch of it, searching for clues that might point them toward the killer. What they found was a cigarette butt in the toilet, a small screwdriver on the bedside table, and Lori's purse with a receipt from Bailey's Lounge. But it wasn't just these items that told the story of her last night. It was the fingerprint on the window blind and the DNA left on her body. Those would be the key to solving the case. But for now, the trail led back to Bailey's Lounge, where a bartender confirmed that Lori had spent the night drinking and dancing with a man who seemed very familiar. He described a tall man with cowboy boots and a hat, a man who had introduced himself as Mike. The bartender also remembered the charming cowboy's favorite drink, a snake bite, Yukon Jack with a shot of lime juice. This tiny circumstantial detail would become one of the few reliable pieces of evidence that detectives could use to trace Cowboy Mike's movements across Washington state. But by the time detectives were able to piece together that Michael John Bray was their suspect, he was already gone. He'd slipped out of Olympia and vanished into the wind, leaving behind nothing but a cold trail and a growing sense of dread for the small communities of Western Washington. For a while, it seemed like Bray might get away with it. He was an expert at evasion, a man who knew how to disappear when the heat got too close. But even as he fled, the noose was tightening around him as he moved through the Pacific Northwest like a shadow. They knew that if they didn't catch him soon, more women would fall victim to his violent urges. They knew it, and they were right. Bray's next stop was Yakima, a city nestled in the eastern side of the state. It was there that he reunited with his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Marshall Morgan. They'd spent time together before, drinking and laughing in bars like the Red Barn in Grand Mound, but this time their reunion would end in blood. Bray shot Marshall in the head, leaving her for dead in a ditch on the outskirts of town. Miraculously, Marshall survived, though she would never be the same. The bullet that should have killed her instead left her with permanent brain damage, robbing her of her memories and her ability to fully understand what had happened to her. While Marshall Morgan lay bleeding and broken, Bray moved on like nothing had happened. He walked into another Yakima bar, calm as ever, and charmed yet another woman. This time, his target took him home. She had no idea that she was inviting a monster into her life. The next morning she woke up disoriented, her clothes missing, and her body bearing the signs of a brutal assault. It wasn't until she saw Bray's face in the newspaper that she realized the truth. She had been violated by the man known as Cowboy Mike. The fear that gripped Yakima and the surrounding areas was palpable. This wasn't just another criminal on the loose. This was a man with a history of violence, a man who had already left a trail of victims across the state. The authorities knew they were dealing with a predator who wouldn't stop until he was caught, or worse, until he slipped away for good. And even then, of course, he wouldn't stop. They just wouldn't have caught him. But Bray wasn't done with small-town Washington yet. After the attack in Yakima, he fled westward back toward Glenoma. Glenoma was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. It was a small town tucked away in the shadow of the mountains, where life moved at an unhurried pace. This small, quiet town seemed like the perfect place for a man on the run to disappear. And it was here at a local garage sale that Bray made his next move. Instead of violence and violation, for now anyway, Mike offered only music, bringing out his guitar and strumming tunes for the people gathered there, blending in as if he were just another passerby. Among those who fell under his spell was Brenda Keene, a local resident. Bray and Keene ended up spending the night together at the Roadside Inn, a small out-of-the-way tavern. But in an odd twist, Bray deviated from his MO and didn't harm Brenda. He left the next morning, slipping away as quietly as he'd arrived. It wasn't until later, when Brenda saw his face in the newspaper, that she realized just how close she'd come to death. She immediately contacted the authorities, providing them with a crucial piece of information: the license plate number of Bray's car. This was the break the police had been waiting for. They tracked Bray's movements, narrowing in on his location, and the chase was on. It was the kind of chase you'd expect to see in a movie, fast, dangerous, and filled with twists and turns. Bray was driving a blue Nissan pickup when the police caught sight of him at a truck stop along Interstate 84 near the Idaho-Oregon border. When officers tried to pull him over, Bray hit the gas, sending his truck speeding down the highway. The police gave chase, their lights flashing and sirens blaring as they pursued him through the winding roads of the Pacific Northwest. But Bray wasn't about to be caught that easily. He'd spent his whole life running, evading the law, and he wasn't about to stop now. As the chase intensified, Bray made a bold move. He swerved off the road, his truck barreling through a barricade set up by the police. The truck careened down a steep embankment, crashing through trees and brush until it came to a stop at the edge of the Snake River. With the police closing in, Bray jumped out of the truck and made a run for the water. The Snake River was wide and fast-moving, its currents strong enough to pull a man under in seconds. But Bray didn't hesitate. He dove in, his body disappearing beneath the surface as the police watched from the shore. For a moment it seemed like he might escape. The river was treacherous, and the police were reluctant to follow him into the freezing waters. But they couldn't just let him get away, not after everything he'd done. So they sent a police dog after him, the animal plunging into the water with the same determination that had driven the officers in their pursuit. As Bray swam, the dog closed in on him. He tried to fight it off, his hands locking around the animal's neck as he attempted to drown it in the churning water. It was a desperate, violent struggle. Man against beast, and for a moment it looked like Bray might win. But the dog held on, refusing to let go even as the current threatened to pull them both under. The struggle in the Snake River was vicious, both man and beast fighting for survival. Bray's muscles strained as he tried to subdue the police dog, his fingers digging into its fur, attempting to force its head beneath the icy water. But the dog was relentless, trained for moments just like this. It fought back with equal ferocity, teeth sinking into Bray's arm, holding onto him with the kind of grip that only years of training could produce. The water churned wildly around them, the current tugging at Bray's legs as he thrashed against the dog, but even as the river pulled them downstream, neither man nor beast relented. Cowboy Mike's breaths came in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep his head above the water, his body exhausted from the fight. For a moment it looked like the river itself might win, dragging both of them beneath the surface, erasing any trace of the chase. But then, through the spray and the chaos, police officers in a boat made their move. They'd been tracking Bray from the shore, maneuvering their boat closer with every passing second. Now, with the fight reaching its peak, they seized their opportunity. The boat surged forward, cutting through the river water with precision, and the officers leapt into action. They pulled Cowboy Mike out of the river, wrestling him onto the deck as he fought with them with what little strength he had left. His limbs flailed, but it was no use. The officers held him down, securing him in cuffs as the dog paddled back to the shore. Its job well done. Cowboy Mike's face was pale, his body soaked and trembling from the cold. His once cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer exhaustion. The Snake River had nearly claimed him, but the law had come out on top this time, and the long chase to capture the monster known as Cowboy Mike had finally come to an end. But even in custody, Michael John Bray didn't go quietly. In the days following his capture, he remained defiant, insisting that he had nothing to do with the murders and assaults he'd been accused of. He clung to his story, claiming that he was an innocent man, a drifter who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the evidence told a different story. Once Bray was behind bars, investigators began to piece together the full scope of his crimes. The DNA evidence from Lori Jones' body matched Bray's, and his fingerprint on the window blind of her apartment tied him directly to the scene of the crime. The prosecution's case was airtight, but that didn't stop Bray from trying to play the system one more time. During his trial, Bray took the stand in his own defense, a move that many found both bold and foolish. He testified that he and Lori had engaged in consensual sex that night and that he had left her alive and well when he walked out of the apartment. But the jury saw through his lies. The DNA evidence was undeniable, and the timeline of events didn't match his story. After a 3-week trial, the jury took only 2.5 hours to deliberate before finding Bray guilty of first-degree rape and second-degree murder. The conviction marked the end of Cowboy Mike's reign of terror. But for many it came far too late. The families of his victims were left to pick up the pieces of their lives shattered by his violence. The survivors, those who had managed to escape Cowboy Mike's grasp, were haunted by the memories of what he had done to them. Justice had been served, but the scars of this American monster would remain. In the years that followed, more details about Bray's life and crimes began to emerge. He was suspected of being involved in the disappearances and deaths of multiple women across the Pacific Northwest, though concrete evidence was harder to come by in those cases. Among his suspected victims was Susan Alt, a woman who had gone missing just weeks before Bray's arrests. Witnesses had seen her arguing with Bray shortly before her disappearance, and though her body was never found, many believed that she had fallen prey to Cowboy Mike. In a hearing in late 2000, this was before the spree that we've just discussed, a judge had ordered Bray to be placed under community supervision after violating his probation for an earlier conviction related to a jail escape. But instead of strict monitoring, Bray was placed in a program that required him only to pay fines. It was a baffling oversight, and one that would allow him to remain free, leading directly and famously, as we've already discussed, to the murderous spree that would eventually see him captured in 2001. But even before these terrible crimes, law enforcement had known that Bray was a dangerous man. In 1998, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office had Bray in their sights. A deputy investigating the death of failure to adequately supervise Bray, who was supposed to have been on a tight leash. By all accounts, Bray should have been in prison or at least under heavy supervision. Instead, he moved freely from town to town, killing and raping as he pleased. The families of Lori Jones and other victims sought justice in civil court, demanding accountability for the state's failures. In the end, the Department of Corrections was forced to settle the lawsuits, paying millions of dollars to the families of the victims. But for those families, no amount of money could ever make up for the loss they had suffered. They had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them, and the consequences had been devastating. Even as the lawsuits wound down and the dust began to settle on Cowboy Mike's case, Bray himself remained a source of frustration for prison officials. He'd always been a man who refused to be confined, and even behind bars he continued to test the limits of the system. He attempted an escape from prison at least 5 times during his incarceration, the most notable being in 2005, when he used a toothbrush to pick a lock and tried to crawl through the ventilation system of Yakima County Jail. Each time his attempts were thwarted, but they only added to his notoriety, his reputation as a feral man who refused to be caged. In 2008, Michael John Bray was finally convicted for the murder of Lori Jones after a 3-week trial. And that trial may have brought a measure of justice for Lori, but the unanswered questions about Bray's other suspected crimes continued to haunt the investigation. Authorities believed he was responsible for the deaths of multiple women, but the concrete evidence was scarce. After his conviction, prosecutors pushed for the maximum sentence, knowing that they were dealing with a man who had a long history of violence and evasion. In the end, Cowboy Mike was sentenced to nearly 48 years in prison, enough time to ensure that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the families of the victims, it wasn't enough, but it was the closest they would get to closure.
Switch to Chrome to load your favorite.
Spokane, Washington State, August the 1st, 1998. On a notorious downtown strip known as the Track, a 46-year-old male picked up a sex worker called Christine. The woman did not know it yet, but the man at the wheel was a serial killer.
He pretended to be exactly what he wasn't. The all-American hero, family man, was actually a sex addict who killed prostitutes for pleasure.
After having sex with her, the killer pulled out his .25 caliber handgun and shot the woman in the head.
She later found bullet fragments in her head.
She had this incredible brush with death and miraculously had escaped with only a bullet wound.
Christine was the only one that survived an attack by Robert Lee Yates Jr. For more than 20 years, Yates preyed on vulnerable young women in and around the Pacific Northwest. Typically, once someone got into his car, their fate was sealed.
Yates simply discarded them as if they were trash that he'd thrown out of his vehicle. And then he gave them after he'd had his fun.
When this all-American family man was finally caught, he was convicted of killing 14 young women and one man. However, it's suspected he have murdered many of the world's most evil killers. Spokane, Washington. For more than 20 years, between 1975 and 1998, a serial killer was on the loose across America's Pacific Northwest. 50-year-old war hero Robert Lee Yates Jr. shocked the world when he was found guilty of mercilessly killing 14 women and one man.
He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an average Joe. And he was a father of 5. He was a decorated pilot in the US Army National Guard.
He has several tours in Germany. He becomes chief warrant officer. In every respect, an all-American hero. The sort of chap that you hang bunting out for when he returns home.
But for more than 20 years, Robert Lee Yates led a double life. At night, he was a cold-blooded serial killer, preying on vulnerable young women, mostly in the city of Spokane. Local journalist Bill Morlin covered the story of the murders.
The common ingredient in these deaths were the women had been picked up on an area in Spokane called East Sprague. It's an area east of the downtown area, and it's sometimes called the Track. The women would be picked up, and he apparently would engage in sexual activities. In some instances, he engaged in drug usage with these women, and then would shoot them, usually in the head. Most of the murders were committed by a .25 caliber handgun. Their bodies would be found many times in drainage ditches or in semi-wooded areas outside of town.
Special Agent Norm Brown is a seasoned investigative force assigned to track down the killer.
This one stands out in that it involved the deaths of so many innocent people. It's very challenging to find this person. The Spokane community was on edge during this investigation. A number of people thought that the investigators weren't doing enough to catch the killer at the time because the victims were prostitutes. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The victims were humans, and they didn't deserve to die, so we were bound and determined to find them.
At the start of the investigation, Yates was not a suspect.
He wasn't on our radar. There was nothing that pointed us in his direction as being the serial killer.
This killer's story began
Go ahead, I'll park the car.
This is amazing!
Well, there goes our street cred.
Violence never solves a problem. Oh, it's actually kind of cool looking.
Your breath stinks! Press start button.
This killer story begins in 1952. On May the 27th, Robert Lee Yates Jr. was born in Spokane and was raised in the small town of Oak Harbor, Washington.
Robert Lee Yates' father worked on a local naval base. He was a blue-collar worker. He had a very close relationship with his father. I think he idolized him. And his father was a coach for a Little League baseball team.
Yates's time at school was very normal.
Robert Lee Yates Jr. played baseball at school, but he wasn't the star on the team. He was good at his schoolwork, but he wasn't the smart person in the class. He was just average. So there was nothing that stood out. There was nothing that said that this family would be the family that would produce a serial killer.
To the outside world, the Yateses were a happy, contented, all-American family.
In many ways, Yates' relationship with his father was completely normal. Usually it's thought that even one positive role model is sufficient to stop people from becoming seriously psychiatrically disturbed, and yet it didn't do anything here. We have to ask ourselves the question, why?
When investigators dug into Yates' family history, they discovered something shocking.
We learned that his grandmother killed his grandfather. And there was some violence in the family, obviously.
His grandmother didn't just kill his grandfather, but she killed him in a especially gruesome way. She took an axe to him, actually. And then was committed to a mental institution. And that becomes, I suspect, an intergenerational message, which is women are very dangerous. They have what you want, but they're very dangerous people.
While there was a violent history in the family, Yates himself allegedly suffered some trauma when he was just 6 years old.
We often find in serial killers that violence is actually rooted in shame. That shame is often something that has happened during the childhood, something that the child felt they had no control over, but something that they felt judged by, something that made them feel less worthy. Robert Lee Yates was sexually assaulted by another child who was a neighbor.
But Yates kept the assault a secret. The incident was never reported to police. After graduating high school, Yates met his first wife. In 1972, aged 20, Yates and his wife moved to the small town of Walla Walla in Washington state, where they enrolled in college. There he spent his free time alone in the woods, hunting, hiking, and fishing.
The parents of his wife, years later, say actually he was quite a loner. We never really got to know him. Even though he was married to their daughter, he was somebody who was quite insular. And it's that constant theme of invisibility.
Yates's marriage to his first wife ended in divorce just 18 months later. However, he had already begun a new relationship with another woman. In December that year, Yates got a job at the Washington State Penitentiary, and the first of their 5 children was born. In July 1976, they were married.
He works as a prison officer, and this is a job that's about the enforcement of rules and regulations. It's about status, and it's about power, and it's about authority. And this also coincides with his first murder.
On July the 13th, 1975, a 23-year-old Yates was practicing shooting targets just outside town near Mill Creek when he came across 2 students. Lifelong friends Susan, aged 22, and Patrick, aged 21, were having a picnic.
This was an area that he knew quite well. It was out in the middle of nowhere, and he was fairly confident that he wasn't going to be disturbed. And it wouldn't surprise me if he'd been fantasizing about this for quite some time. And he comes across 2 college graduates, and he decides that he's going to kill them. And that's what he does. He literally shoots them in cold blood.
A rage burst out. He acted entirely instinctively and shot them both. It is unimaginable. Why would you do that? There is something profoundly out of kilter in Yates's personality.
For Yates, simply murdering the young friends was not enough.
He placed the body of Susan on top of that of Patrick, and Susan's body, he'd removed a lot of her clothing. So this is really humiliating. This is really demeaning.
Yates left the bodies by the side of the creek and covered them with a pile of rubbish, a sleeping bag, and an old tire.
Yates essentially assassinates them. And what his motivation was is, I mean, it's anyone's guess. Did he think that these people were being sinful? Did it go against his religious upbringing? I'm only speculating. There's no way of knowing. He's never talked about what motivated him to kill that young couple.
This would have been an escalation of behaviour rather than a switch being flipped. People don't just decide to kill overnight. They don't turn into murderers one day, having been completely normal the previous day. I think that he was probably stalking people. He was probably fantasizing about harming others.
Walla Walla, Washington, 1977. 2 years after murdering 2 students, in October he decided
he was serving in Somalia. He allegedly shot a pig from the helicopter, and that wouldn't have been an easy thing to achieve in a moving airborne vehicle. It's something that he did that he didn't have to do. He wanted to prove to himself that he could hit a target from that far away.
Wherever Warrant Officer Yates was stationed, trouble seemed to follow.
Women in that area near where he'd been stationed, many of them prostitutes, suddenly ended up dead.
But without conclusive evidence, Yates was never tied to these mysterious murders.
Apparently, because of the lapse of time and because of technology issues, there was no DNA saved from some of those victims.
On April the 1st, 1996, the father of 5, 44-year-old Yates made a surprising decision. After nearly 2 decades of distinguished service, he resigned his position.
He pulls out and suddenly returns to Spokane. He only had to serve a further 18 months before he would have got a full military pension. Now, why would a man with 5 children and a wife suddenly decide to leave the army? I think the answer lies in another killing.
In August 1995, Dale County, Alabama. 8 months before Yates's resignation, a 19-year-old transvestite prostitute was shot in the face by an unknown killer. The body was found dumped on the roadside bordering Fort Rucker, an Army aviation base where Yates had been stationed at the time for training. A culprit was never found, but some continue to speculate.
I think that unknown killer was Robert Lee Yates Jr. And I think that's why he left the army suddenly. That I feel that he was appalled. Here is a woman who is actually a man. I think Yates flipped, and I think that's why he suddenly snatched his wife and family out of a very good army career, which was about to see him get a substantial and generous pension and take them back to Spokane out of the blue.
And this is a real pivotal moment, I think, in his life, because he's somebody who operates quite well when there are boundaries around him. But now those boundaries are gone, I think we're going to see some changes.
Though it's never been proven, he's suspected of committing 2 other murders between 1995 and 1996 in Washington state. And in the following year, Yates picked up the pace.
He was intent on killing, and intent on killing prostitutes. He would target prostitutes, perhaps because they were easy, perhaps because no one would miss them.
In 1997, Yates joined the Army National Guard, hoping to become a helicopter pilot.
We have him entering yet another career that involves him enforcing the law. So this is something that enables him to continue having that power and that control and that status.
But Yates's flying career was quickly put on hold as his medical results were being processed.
He's grounded, he's not allowed to fly his helicopter. Now, this is a pivotal moment for me because somebody else has taken control, somebody else has made that decision. He's not the one that's in the driving seat anymore.
Despite not initially being able to fly, he remains in the National Guard. But with a large family to support, he takes on a menial job at a manufacturing plant in Spokane. And all the while, Yates continued to kill.
I think the murders that he committed were an attempt to get back control. I think there were things happening in his life that he felt were out of his control, and he wanted to feel powerful again.
His new hunting ground was the seedy strip in downtown Spokane, known as The Track.
Prostitutes to Yates were easy targets in that they would get into his vehicle without any questions asked. They would just decide upon what money was going to be exchanged for services. And the prostitutes were very vulnerable because most of them were drug addicts, and they'd sell themselves for money and use it to buy drugs.
Robert Lee Yates was very much a regular face on the sex workers scene in this part of town at the time. So he wouldn't just pick up women to have sex with, he would do drugs with them. He became part of their community. And I think he would be trusted by them. He was somebody that they knew.
In the summer of 1997, Yates picked up 20-year-old Heather from the downtown track to have sex with her.
But I suspect that the victims may not have known even the second before they died that this was going to be a killing, because I suspect their interaction went down much as an interaction with a prostitute goes down. And then when he was done, he draws his gun and he shoots.
Yates shot Heather in the head with a .22 caliber handgun.
Literally, there's just a second that the victim becomes aware that something's amiss, and after that, the victim is dead.
After Yates murdered Heather, he dumped her body on the side of the road.
Well, he was brazen in his thought as far as dumping the bodies.
In August that year, Yates was back on the track looking for easy prey. He picked up 16-year-old Jennifer. Like the young woman before her, her fate was a foregone conclusion.
Unlike many serial killers, the way that Yates kills is instrumental. He has sex with his victims, and then he pulls out a gun and he shoots them. They die virtually instantaneously at the hand of somebody who knows how to use weapons effectively. He's not trying to torture, he's not trying to terrorize, he's simply eliminating the witness.
He watches as the life literally drains from them. And this is an individual who's not going to stop because his offending is getting worse. It's becoming more sadistic.
Once dead, Yates prepared to move Jennifer's body, a ritual he would repeat time and time again.
After shooting them in the heads, he put bags over their head, largely to keep his car clean. I mean, he didn't want the blood dripping out and would put plastic bags over their heads to keep the mess off his car.
10 days later, local farmers found Jennifer's badly decomposed body. It had been dumped in brush northeast of Spokane.
This site where Jennifer was found, it was next to a working farm near to an alfalfa field. So he's not really seeming too bothered about covering up. It seems that he just wants to get away at this point in time.
That same day, officers made another grim discovery, another of his victims.
Heather is found in a field in a parking lot off the strip in East Spokane.
Robert Yates would typically bury them slightly or partially. Other times he would cover them with debris. Many of them were found nude or semi-nude. They were discarded like trash along the road.
And that's exactly how he saw these women. He saw them as disposable. He saw them for just his own pleasure, and then he'd get rid of them after he'd had his fun.
But this time, the Spokane-based detectives had a vital lead.
We received a tip that one of the victims, Jennifer Joseph, was last seen getting into a white Corvette.
On the 24th of September 1997, a local police officer patrolling the track pulled Yates for speeding.
And a police officer actually had stopped him to fill out a report, but in the vehicle description, instead of writing down Corvette, the officer wrote down CAM, apparently referring to a Camaro.
The police officer actually wrote down that he was in a different kind of car, and that meant that they missed Robert Lee Yates.
Later that autumn, Yates picked up Darla, a 28-year-old sex worker, on the track.
He would pick up these women, he would shoot them in the head, and then he would bury their bodies. So this was very cold, this was very kind of executioner style.
Darla's body was found on November the 5th, 1997, 10 miles south of downtown Spokane on Hangman Valley Road.
I visited the recovery site of Darla, and she was dumped in some bushes by some trees and rolled down a hill, but not very far off the Hangman Valley Road, where I often rode my bicycle for exercise. When I ride by there, I always think of her, and my heart goes out to her and her family, because she was treated like trash after she was killed.
In December that year, Yates's killing spree spread some 300 miles east to Tacoma, an area he's familiar with.
As a pilot with the Washington Army National Guard, he was based here in Spokane, but on certain weekends he would travel to the other side of the state, to near Tacoma, Washington, where he would do military weekend drills.
On December the 6th, Yates chose his next victim. He picked up 34-year-old sex worker Melinda.
Robert Lee Yates didn't just target an area that he was familiar with. He would be carrying out his crimes in areas where he just happened to find himself. He was in Tacoma on one particular date, and this coincided with the murder of Melinda.
Melinda's body was found the following day, dumped in wasteland by a railroad track.
I think at this point he's becoming quite arrogant. He's not gotten caught so far, so he's pushing the boundaries a little bit. And you see this happen with quite a lot of serial killers. They have this kind of proneness to boredom, this need for stimulation, this need to kind of mix things up a bit. And I think that's what he's doing when he's killing outside of the area he knows.
By the end of 1997, the 45-year-old serial killer had shot and murdered at least 12 innocent people. Most were vulnerable young women.
I think the fact that sex workers in this area were still going out and still working, even though they knew that their friends and their acquaintances were being killed by this serial killer, just shows what desperate circumstances these women live in. They have to go out, they have to work for money, often to feed drug habits.
On December the 22nd, 1997, police set up a special task force in Spokane to catch the serial killer terrorizing America's Pacific Northwest. But the killings that holiday season continued, unabated.
Robert Lee Yates murders Sonny during the Christmas period of 1997, where most people are celebrating the festivities with their families. This really does show me that serial killers don't take time out. They don't stop for the holidays. They want to keep killing because they enjoy it, because it gives them power and it gives them control.
A day after Christmas, detectives discovered the lifeless bodies of two more women. Both were found within the Spokane city limits.
Laurel and Sean, their bodies were found at the same time. Laurel was shot in the head and discarded like a piece of rubbish. Sean was another one of Robert Lee Yates's victims, and I think he was getting a little bit arrogant, he was getting a little bit sloppy at the time of her killing. So after he killed her, he placed the plastic bag over her head, and there was a print that was found on that bag, and that turned out to be his print. So as he's becoming more bold, as he's becoming more confident, he's starting to make mistakes.
Fear amongst the general public escalated as the murders across the Pacific Northwest continued.
But by the end of the 90s, there were like a dozen or so of these prostitutes who had turned up dead, and there was no killer in custody. And by then, everyone was saying, we have a serial killer in our midst, and something needs to be done about it.
I think the impact of his crimes on the community were incredibly significant, because here's this guy who appears to be completely regular, completely average, completely invisible, to be honest, somebody who didn't really stand out, and yet he was able to wreak such havoc across the community.
By January 1998, the number of unsolved murder cases in Spokane had drastically risen. The FBI was called in to assist the Spokane Task Force in catching the killer.
The Spokane Serial Killer Task Force had hundreds of leads to begin with, turned into be thousands of leads. Some of those leads were interstate, in fact, even in other countries. So they asked the FBI to get involved.
Special Agent Norm Brown was the FBI's liaison officer who coordinated efforts and resources with the Spokane Serial Killer Task Force.
It's difficult to work these type of cases because we know women are being killed the longer we can't find the serial killer. So we're anxious to find the killer, so that works on the head and the hearts of the investigators. I spent about 100 hours plus following leads and helping the task force. It was challenging. We tried to think why the killer would pick this site to dump the bodies. Generally, they're found in fields or in wooded areas, but not always. A couple of bodies were found within the city limits.
On January the 19th, 1998, the task force sponsored a candlelit vigil to memorialize the many women who'd been murdered on the streets of Spokane, in the hope it would lead to more information about the killer.
There was a lot of community outrage. A lot of people thought that the law enforcement authorities weren't giving us enough attention because of who these victims were. There were candlelight vigils, and of course there were undercover police there watching to see who would show up.
But there were no further leads. 4 months later, Yates sold his white Corvette, a car he'd been stopped in for speeding in on the track by police the previous year. He began prowling his favorite hunting ground in a big black van.
Robert Lee Yates really is the embodiment of the arrogant, narcissistic serial killer who really does know his patch, that he would go up and down, and he set up his vehicle as a mobile sex unit. So this is a guy who's very confident in what he's doing. He's hiding in plain sight. He's almost taunting the police, essentially, and saying, hey, everybody, look at me, look what I'm up to, and none of you have caught me yet.
In May 1998, Yates picked up 43-year-old Melody downtown. Like his previous victims, he followed the same deadly routine. After he'd had sex with her, he killed her. Melody was reported missing by her family shortly after she disappeared. Even with support from the FBI, the task force were unable to locate her body.
Melody had been missing for several days, weeks, and then months. She was last seen living with her sister in Minnesota, or that she was working the streets in Tennessee, or selling drugs in California. None of these leads panned out. It's like she just dropped off the face of the earth.
Shortly after Melody's murder, the overconfident killer began to make a series of mistakes. In July that year, Yates picked up 47-year-old Michelin downtown. This time, Yates buried her body close to home, a block from the manufacturing company in Spokane where he worked.
The body of Michelin was actually found near Robert Lee Yates' place of work, and I think this shows how arrogant and how incredibly confident he was becoming in his killing. Very often, serial killers will keep a clear separation between their work life and their home life and their killing, but it's starting to merge into one.
Police questioned a number of employees who worked at the manufacturing company, including Yates. But with no evidence to link him to the murder, no further action was taken.
And he's actually interviewed in relation to the discovery of this body. And part of me thinks he probably quite enjoyed that. He probably quite enjoyed the police asking him questions, knowing that he knew all along who was responsible.
Like many serial killers, he starts slow and begins to escalate, and the frequency of the killing and the amount of the killing gets more and more. And there's something else that becomes more and more over time. He makes less and less efforts to hide the bodies after a while.
But Yates's luck was about to run out. On August 1st, 1998, Yates picked up another sex worker, Christine Smith, in downtown Spokane.
Christine Smith got inside the van of Robert Yates, attempted to perform oral sex on him, and during that process, she felt a sharp blow to her head. And she immediately got out, ran away.
It was like a glancing blow, and she didn't even realize initially that she'd been shot. It was a superficial wound near her ear, as I recall.
Christine Smith's case really is absolutely astounding. She thought she'd just been stabbed, and she managed to escape the car and go and get help from people. This is a witness who has survived. This is a witness who can identify him, and it's only a matter of time before the police catch up with him.
Despite Christine's escape, Yates was unable to contain the urge to kill. In September, he was on the hunt again. Sex worker Connie was his next victim. Her body was found weeks later by a search and rescue dog down an embankment in Pierce County, Tacoma.
These women turning up dead, and most of them were prostitutes. And it was the common theme with these victims. And they were difficult to find background information about them, and they were turning up dead one at a time. And many of these cases would result in just, a short little news item on the evening news or in the newspaper.
The following month, Yates went on the prowl to his favorite hunting ground, the track. On November the 10th, 1998, he picked up sex worker Jennifer. But before Yates could make his move, they were pulled over and his details were taken down.
And a police officer actually had stopped him and filled out a police report about suspicious activity. He had a young woman in the car with him, and there was no criminal conduct that he could be arrested on the spot for. And the police officer filled out a report.
The police encounter saved Jennifer's life. Yates immediately dropped her off just a few blocks away. Spokane, Washington, 1999. After almost 30 years, Robert Lee Yates Jr., the serial killer responsible for at least 13 murders, is still on the loose. Following 2 police interviews the previous year, detectives discovered that Yates had once owned a white Corvette, a car linked to one of the victims found in 1997.
There was a witness who saw Jennifer Joseph getting into a white Corvette on that summer evening that she disappeared. And a white Corvette is quite a distinctive vehicle. It's one that you're not going to mistake for something else. And this is something that's going to be really important in the conviction of Robert Lee Yates.
On September the 15th, 1999, 47-year-old Yates was brought in for questioning.
Robert Lee Yates is called in by the police, and he can't account for his whereabouts on a couple of the key dates. One of the things that really does trip him up is the police are presenting their evidence to him, and they say about a white Camaro being seen. And he corrects them. He goes, "Oh no, it's not a Camaro, it's a Corvette."
Yates' admission was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough to arrest him. Police needed more evidence to link him to the Washington murders. Yates was released the same day. The task force issued a search warrant and tracked down the new owner of the 1977 white Corvette that Yates had sold.
They pulled registrations for every white Corvette in Idaho and Washington and this region and winnowed that down and ultimately located the Corvette that Robert Yates had once owned.
The task force recovered Yates's white Corvette and submitted it to forensic examination.
The investigators were able to recover evidence that linked Yates to the killing of one of the prostitutes.
One of the victims, Jennifer Joseph, had carpet fibers on her body. They processed that car and found the same kind of carpet threads that matched Jennifer.
Jennifer Joseph had been murdered 2 years earlier, and her body was found in an alfalfa field northeast of Spokane.
The detectives meticulously took the Corvette apart, and in that process, they found a small button that matched the kind of button that was on the clothing worn by Jennifer Joseph. They then knew that Jennifer Joseph had been in that vehicle prior to her death.
Investigators also found a number of bloodstains. When tested, they revealed DNA belonging to Jennifer.
They knew that her murder had been in that vehicle before she'd been dumped in a field northwest of Spokane.
All of the evidence is starting to match up, and it leads them right back to Robert Lee Yates.
The task force put in a warrant for Yates's arrest.
By the time the detectives get a warrant for his arrest, they were 100% certain they've got the right man.
On April the 17th of 2000, the task force put Yates under 24-hour surveillance.
The police had staked out the family home, made sure that he was there, and after he left for work at 6 o'clock the following morning, they moved in and they arrested him.
The same day, detectives searched Yates's house for further evidence. Immediately after his arrest, a sample of Yates's DNA was taken and compared with samples collected from a number of murder victims found between 1996 and 1998.
It was tested that day and came back late that afternoon. I recall that we were at the Yates home conducting a search when we got word that the DNA matched Robert Yates. At least 8 of the victims had the same DNA found on them, so we knew we were dealing with a serial killer. All the investigators were very happy. We were actually elated.
The day after Yates was apprehended, a newspaper report was released detailing his arrest. Upon seeing it, former sex worker Christine Smith instantly recognized Yates as being the man who shot her in the back of his van in August of 1998. At the time of the incident, she thought she'd been stabbed and had reported it to police.
It wasn't until a couple of years later, when she was involved in a car wreck, that she went to the hospital and they discovered shrapnel in her head. And then she realizes that she's actually been shot. She hasn't been stabbed. Somebody has held a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. And not only that, this person who's done this is Robert Lee Yates, and she realizes I could have been one of his victims.
Christine's evidence helped connect the final pieces of the puzzle.
Her coming forward was very crucial to the task force. She came forward, provided the information to law enforcement, and she was a living victim, if you will. It's a living person that could testify against Robert Yates.
A month later, in May of 2000, investigators meticulously searched Yates's black van. They discovered blood pertaining to 2 other victims, 3 bullet holes and spent bullets and bullet debris containing Christine's DNA.
When the task force finally got to her, they had the bullet fragment surgically removed, and it ballistically matched up to the same weapon that was used in some of these other killings.
While searching Yates's property, investigators discovered the murder weapons.
He used handguns. Some of the victims may also have been killed with a .22, but most of the murders were committed by a .25 caliber handgun.
The task force now had enough evidence to charge him with a total of 13 murders and the attempted murder of Christine Smith. In October of 2000, at the Spokane Superior Court, Yates faced his charges. In front of a packed room, the serial killer took to the stand and made a shock plea.
Yates, to the surprise of many, goes to court and pleads guilty to 13 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder.
The callous killer avoided going to trial by pleading guilty to the murders.
Robert Lee Yates struck a plea bargain. He confessed to 13 murders and actually got life in prison without the possibility of parole.
As part of the deal, Yates revealed a horrible secret.
Robert Yates agreed to disclose the location of Melanie. None of the investigators knew where she was, and the family didn't know where she was either. So he agreed to lead us to her body.
Using Yates's hand-drawn map, the task force excavated an area to the east side of the killer's home.
Her body was located in Robert Yates's yard, buried. It was his trophy, so to speak. It was pretty horrendous. When the investigators were conducting the search inside the house, no one ever dreamt that she would be buried right outside his bedroom. We were surprised and dejected to know that he would do such a thing.
This says he wants to be able to watch over the body of this victim, to have control over this crime scene.
There's obviously some sadistic kind of a thrill associated with that. I mean, this body was buried at his family home, right outside the bedroom where he and his wife slept.
Yates's deal with the police saved his life.
That was a strong selling point, that he would give up the location of her body and he would get a life sentence as opposed to the death penalty. And the investigators, including myself, believed that he should get a death sentence. If the death sentence doesn't apply to him, who does it apply to? He ended up getting 408 years for the murders.
In 2002, prosecutors in Pierce County charged Yates with 2 additional murders, that of Melinda in 1997 and of Connie in 1998. Yates murdered both women in Pierce County, Washington.
In 2002, he was convicted of further murders, and for those murders, he actually received the death penalty.
In October of 2002, Yates was sentenced to death by lethal injection, but Washington state has now abolished capital punishment. As a result, Yates is now serving life in prison without the possibility of parole in Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. In an ironic twist of fate, he's now housed in the same facility that he once served in as a prison guard 25 years earlier. A fitting end for the monstrous murderer.
That is the most shocking part of this. He was just the guy that everybody has living next door to them. He wasn't this three-eyed monster or some sexual psychopath or registered sex offender. I mean, he was a father. He lived in a modest, upscale part of town. He'd been in the military, just about as ordinary as you could possibly get.
And didn't look like a monster either. He looked like an average Joe. This averageness is something that actually played to his advantage as a serial killer.
Convicted of 15 cold-blooded murders, Spokane's mass murderer is suspected of taking many more innocent lives, and that makes Robert Lee Yates Jr. one of the world's most evil killers.